news on the... Yeah, please, Dan.
Hi. So, hi, I'm Dan Brickley from Google. I work in our King's Cross office, just around the corner here in London. I'm going to talk about some collaborative work that we've done to support interchange of data amongst fact checkers. It's called Claim Review. I expect you'll hear mentions of it throughout the day, so I wanted to give you an introduction early in the day. And my goal is just to leave you with a rough sense of what it is, where it came from, and how it might evolve in the future. So we've got a lot to cover in today's conference, and I want to begin by listing some of the many themes that I will not be talking about. Google is rather a large company, and there are a vast number of ways in which our work engages with issues around trust and truth and misinformation. I could probably use up my entire time here listing the things I'm not going to talk about, but I wanted to mention in particular I won't be talking about web search ranking or web search quality, about YouTube, about NewsLab, about advertising, or about AI and machine learning. Not because these things are unimportant, but because I wanted to focus on something I know a little about. So instead I'm talking about our efforts to create and promote structured data standards and that make it easier for information from fact-checking organizations to flow around the web. To give it a technology platform company perspective, there's a mismatch in the numbers when you look at the fact-checking world and the world of tech platforms. As you heard earlier, for my colleagues at Google, we deal with billions of things. Billions of queries, billions of users, billions of pages. When you look at fact-checking as a growing network of organizations, we're dealing with a few hundred organizations, and they're proud to have created some number of hundreds or thousands of fact checks. I think a lot of the opportunity and a lot of the difficulties is about bridging that gap between terrifyingly huge and rather small. And the reason I focus on standards is if you've gone to the trouble of creating a fact check, that's an important, useful, and expensive piece of work. Let's try and make sure that that fact check serves humanity as best it can. So in particular, I want to introduce this claim review thing, which we use to understand fact-checking information that we find in the web. I want to say where it came from and how it's currently being used, and give some overview of the ongoing work and things coming up. The message basically is that claim review is simple, possibly too simple, but it's useful and it's practical, and it provides an interesting basis from which we can explore richer approaches to data sharing around trust and truth. So I was really pleased to see I'm speaking alongside representatives both of Facebook and Bing. Since these efforts I'm talking about, they've been successful in large part not because of stuff we did solely at Google, but because of collaborations between Google, Bing, Facebook as well, and the wider world of fact-checking, including many of the organizations here today. So where did this claim review thing come from? I'm going to say a little bit about where it came from before showing some examples. It basically came out of a conversation between some Google people and the team around PolitiFact, in particular its founder, Bill Adair. So we began by asking how we might define technology standards to help organizations like PolitiFact, to help their fact-checking, in PolitiFact's case, of US political discourse, reach a wider audience or a better audience, or be surfaced in more interesting ways through platforms such as Google's. And within a few months of those brainstorming conversations, we were seeing this markup being published on websites, not just politifact.com, but factcheck.org, the Washington Post, and others. And after Google News, and then Google Search, and then Bing adopted the markup in products, that provided an incentive for many other fact-checking sites to start to publish this markup. So at this point, I want to take a pause to make it clearer what exactly I'm talking about. I'm aware that many of you here may not be technologists, and even web technologists may think I'm being a bit vague so far. Schema.org claim review markup is the answer to the question, how did that happen? For various places, like this on Google search results, in which articles containing fact checks are highlighted in user-facing platforms like Google News. Excuse me. So for the Google search experience shown in this image above here, how did Google know that the page described a fact check? how did it know which bit of text summarizing the claim, which bit of text in that page was summarizing the claim that's being evaluated? And how did it know which party was described as making the claim? Mostly because the page contained claim review markup. So here you can see we're highlighting, in response to a query, the world is flat, a fact check from the Square World, where are we? From example.com, evaluating a claim by the Square World Society. And we pull out the specific claim that the world is flat, you can sail over the edge. So this is mostly a fictional example. So to get to more real examples, here we see fact-check articles showing up in a dedicated section of Google News. Zooming in so you might be able to read it, but basically just to give you an idea that this stuff is surfacing in new ways within Google because of this markup that we defined. So here you see AFP, Full Fact, Truth or Fiction, and Washington Post fact-checking articles surfaced in a dedicated section. How did Google know that these were fact-check articles? Again, the answer is because of the claim review markup, usually. So this launched in Google News in October 2016, and we followed it in April 2017 by supporting Google Search, which has somewhat different dynamics because it's a much broader corpus. So this is how it looks in Google Search. So how does Google Search know which claims a fact-check article is evaluating? Again, we use claim review markup, either extracted from the page itself or increasingly from a nearby collaborative database, which I will come back to later. So claim review was defined within the context of the larger schema.org project, which Google and Bing, Yahoo, and Yandex search engines co-founded back in 2011. So the development of Bing and later Facebook supporting the markup was a very natural thing. The markup was always designed to be multi-stakeholder. It's not a Google file format. That would have been a huge mistake. So 2018, Facebook also announced their support for claim review. I should also emphasize that the success and value of this approach is absolutely not all about big companies. Collaboration with individual fact-checking organizations and with centers of technical expertise like Duke Reporters Lab and Full Fact, they've helped guide the evolution of claim review. In particular, early adoption of claim review was made a lot easier through the Duke Reporters Lab's Share the Facts project, which helped sites publish the markup, even if they didn't have a lot of technical expertise. So finally, some markup. I went to the back of the room and looked, and it's really hard to read, and that's kind of the point. You shouldn't worry about the detail here. I just wanted to show a couple of examples of the markup to ground things a little, but don't try and understand that. This is, it's nothing more than a chunk of structured data that's typically embedded within a web page of fact-checking articles. So if you go to PolitiFact and view source in a web browser, or Full Fact, or these others, you'll see something like this. I've skipped some of the complexities because they wouldn't fit on the slide and the font would have got even smaller. But basically, I'll read to you in English what this says to computers. It says that there is a claim review published on the 22nd of June 2016, such and so URL. The item that it reviews is a work authored by the Square World Society, which was published on the 20th of June. The claim which appeared in that work and which is being reviewed is that the world is flat. Now, the author of the fact check, that is of this claim review, is marked up as an organization called example.com Science Watch. And finally, we attach an optional rating. In this case, we say on a scale of 1 worst to 5 best, this is a 1, which means roughly that it's false. So to read the whole complete fact check properly, naturally you're expected to be human. But for computers, we have this nice, if rather basic, summary of the situation. What was the underlying claim being examined? Who said it? Where and when? Who's evaluating it? And what did they conclude? So different fact checkers, different fact-checking organizations, they might publish slight variations on this structure, depending on the information they choose to collect and organize. We've tried not to squeeze everything from every fact check into the computer format. Truth and trust are complex creatures, and it doesn't always fit into nice databasey structures. Instead, what we've done is summarize some of the most important structure of many fact checks, but we never forget that fact checks are ultimately created by and for humans. So the link to the fact-check article ensures that the full detail can be explored by readers. They can actually click through and read and think, if that's their inclination, without needing to fit everything into a database structure. So by separating out the different parts of a fact-check, we make it somewhat easier to reuse the data and have it show up in different software environments and different user interfaces. So Duke Reporters Lab, for example, they've explored voice-based interfaces using Amazon's Alexa and Google Assistant. So another real-world example, this one from Full Fact. Here we can see some of the practicalities involved in mapping the actual real-world practice of individual fact-checking organizations into the claim review data structure. So such mappings are never perfect. In this particular case, you can see how a single field currently combines the verdict, wrong, with an explanation of the rating, which says an extension of a few months would cost no more than leaving with a deal in October 2019, which is still the government's publicly stated policy. So in this particular case, those two pieces of information are in one field, and we've been discussing with Mevan and others whether it's useful to break this out into two separate structures. And that's roughly the spirit in which we try to evolve claim review. Keep it as simple as possible and try and incrementally improve things without making life hard for fact checkers. Where are we? So some other tooling. This is completely unreadable. But at Google, we've produced some additional tooling to help fact checkers and journalists work with claim review data. So the Fact Check Explorer, seen over my shoulder here, it provides another interface to the data that we found in the web. We also republished some of this data via datacommons.org and have recently developed a claim review markup tool which allows sites to create claim review data directly through web forms. And the resulting markup from that is then published back via Data Commons for others to use, Bing and Facebook and friends. So in parallel to this, Full Fact and Duke have both been working on tooling and guidance and documentation to ease the adoption and creation of this markup. Rather than go too deeply into the tools and the technology, I want instead to touch on some of the modeling challenges that are ahead of us. So I've shown hopefully that the basic approach is reasonably simple, bordering on simplistic, and that it's both useful and being used, but I've also hinted at some of the difficulties that we face as we try and build this thing out and scale it up to the numbers we see on the web. So behind the computer format issues, there are some larger, older, but still practical questions that border on the philosophical. So how can we identify, catalog, cross-reference, and share claims about the world, the utterances and the media appearances that carry them, or even the logic of the underlying ideas that they express? I think these are the right questions to be asking, not about file formats and tags and computer protocols. If we ask those questions, we realize that often the same claim can surface in 2 or 3 completely different linguistic surface forms. And if we want to be able to tie descriptions of claims to descriptions of data sets, for example, then some deeper modeling and mapping may be needed. Another question is how can we better describe factually accurate information so that it can be discovered and cited appropriately when factual matters are being debated? There's a whole other completely parallel set of work around the schemas to describe data sets that I'm not going to cover here at all. Last year at Google, we launched a dataset search engine, and our goal is for these things to mesh. That finding descriptions of claims, dodgy claims, true claims, is only a part of the landscape. And this came across very strongly when I first met the Full Fact team, that they were passionate about dataset discovery, as well as Markup to describe the work that they do themselves. Okay, so the official definition of claim review over at schema.org, the project that I run, is somewhat deceptively simple. In practice, there are various areas where improvements and elaborations could be made. The challenge we face in doing so in a way that is in doing this in a way that respects the unique nature of the fact-checking ecosystem. We want to minimize the creation of avoidable technical burdens on fact-checking organizations whose speciality is in checking facts and not with messing around with ever-changing, excuse me, that was 15 minutes, ever-changing structured data formats. It's very easy to get very nerdy about this stuff. And if you happen to be fortunate to work in a large technology company, we've got a lot of engineers and many fact-checking organizations. Sometimes they share a part-time technical coder with other organizations in neighboring countries. And we need to be very mindful of that as we try and make these formats more expressive and fancy. So a few thoughts on possible improvements and future work. There's another one that came up in the conversations this morning already that I didn't write down. So we recently added the notion of claim appearances. This speaks to the issue I mentioned earlier of tech platforms playing whack-a-mole with the same thing popping up again and again and again and again. We don't just want to know that there's a claim that lemonade cures cancer. We don't want to know which pages have got that claim in it. So we, last year, extended the data format to talk about not just claims in the abstract, but their particular appearances in the web. One of the points of clarification there is whether we point to fact checks of those claims, or the appearances of those claims where it's being asserted, or the kind of grey area in between. What else we got? There's the issue of clusters of related claims, or the same claim in different countries. Crime is falling is a commonplace piece of political discourse across the world. In a sense, it's the same claim, but it's important to sort of tie the particular linguistic form of a claim to its social context. It's not just someone said claim is falling, but someone said in the UK claim is falling last week. Crime is falling, rather. We could do a better job modeling exact quotations, their translations, and things like the paraphrasing of claims to take out provocative or hateful language. I mentioned already we could do more work tying things to open data so that you can actually go to government statistics or trusted expert materials to tie the claim to evidence that pulls one way or the other. There are several active conversations around better support for rich media. So fact-checking content that is audio, video, games and so on even, animated GIFs, subtitles, captions, images, and broadcast materials. There's a related issue of sometimes the fact-checking itself might be expressed through podcasts or video materials. And we don't want the computer formats to hold back innovation in the fact-checking community. If you're expressing your fact-checks through podcasts, it's on our shoulders to make sure the data formats can capture that. Again, without making them too complicated for everybody else. That's a tricky balancing act. I wanted to flag a possibility of collaborating with Wiki Data. So wikidata.org is the Wikipedia project's shared database of facts. It's one of the most active and successful areas of Wikipedia right now. And it has already database kind of records on newspapers, journalists, and a number of the more common conspiracy theories. So for example, wikidata.org/Q190706 is their way of identifying moon landing conspiracies. So they're starting to come into our territory here. It's not clear what kind of collaboration we could build. And another world, I don't know how well represented it is here, is the world of libraries. A lot of this stuff predates computers, but librarians have been thinking about it pretty much forever. Do we have any librarians here? Maybe next year. Okay. I also want just to emphasize that the claim review data structure sits alongside dozens of other similar structures, some of which overlap in territory. So for example, you can mark up question and answer content, or frequently asked questions, or health information or data sets, not using claim review, but using other schemas that we defined at schema.org. So all the requirements from the fact-checking world don't fall on the shoulders solely of the claim review data structure. There are other things that we can use and can combine. Finally, there was a conversation at the Global Fact Conference, I think not last year, the year before, where a bunch of fact-checkers got together in the basement and compared their rating schemes. And they looked, at first glance, rather similar, 1 to 5, 1 to 7, until you started talking about what they actually meant. And a 2 or a 3 from one fact-checker to a computer could look really similar, but the definitions were rather different. I wish I'd got a concrete example to flesh that out. But Mevan's nodding, so I feel heard and verified. Where are we? That's about it, really. So claim review has come a long way since brainstorming in 2015. It's absolutely critically important to keep things simple for adoption by fact checkers, both in terms of tooling and standards, but also keeping the data format from getting too fancy. Claim review makes it easier for fact check content to flow between systems and platforms, but it doesn't impose a monolithic model on the ecosystem. So it's natural and healthy that approaches vary between fact checkers. That is a good thing, and we shouldn't allow computer stuff to in any way add friction to that. If you want to engage with the standards effort, please engage via schema.org. As I'm talking to people recently, I'm realizing that we need a better forum for engagement, and I think we'll have a mailing list that's all about claim review, rather than our previous use of GitHub, which is great for computer programmers and not great for everybody else. That's it, really. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Hi, my name is Katja Schutter from the University of Amsterdam. Thank you for the very interesting talk. So it seems that much of the work on misinformation has focused generally on sort of the binary distinction between something being true versus something being false, right? However, it seems that generally online and also in the social media and also in the news media, there's a lot of content that is not maybe strictly false, but is sort of highly opinionated and presents a biased perspective on a particular issue, which has an effect on the audiences. So this is true possibly for the whole articles or maybe for individual claims. And so I was wondering, if you have any thoughts on extending this kind of framework to somehow incorporate this, solve this problem, or extend it to addressing this problem.
Firstly, I don't think it's going to solve anything. Hopefully it can be an ingredient or a tool that can help people do things. You're absolutely right, and there's a limit to the strictly factual, and there's a limit to the plain debunking of obviously untrue claims. I'm personally impressed by Full Fact in that their fact checks often emphasize nuanced discussion, different sides of the debate, and so on. And I want to stress that the claim review markup, it highlights that kind of work, drives attention to those kind of things, and eventually sometimes people have to stop and think and read, and there's a limit to the power of a computer format to make people think. But I think also there's a limit to fact-checking in terms of framing debates purely about facts. That when you have, for example, 350 million for our NHS on the side of a bus as a driver of political discussion, it's not enough to say, was it 350 or 200 or 250? And we can overemphasize on the factual nature of the question and miss the larger manipulation that's happening in society. I should probably say that's a personal view, not a Google view.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question about the claim review standard. Do you have any plans for annotating the instance of the stance of the claim, so it may be supporting or just reporting on the news? So the appearance of the claim itself could be on the news, like on BBC, and just reporting that someone made the claim, but the source is actually not supporting the claim, but just reporting.
That's the kind of data that platforms and other technology people in this community would really like to see more of. At schema.org and at Google, there's a limit to what we can do. We can make sure the schemas support the possibility of describing appearances, and we've pretty much done that. We don't want to make work for fact-checking organizations. So if fact-checking organizations want to describe those rich pieces of information, that's great, but it's a lot of work. There's the larger question of tooling around NLP and automated fact-checking and so on. So you can run a piece of software against some subtitles to say this fact-check may be pertinent to this subtitle. We would like to see that, but it's not something within the gift of the schema effort to make happen.
Thanks for the talk. I'm here. So my question is, does this schema have the ability to, allow fact checkers to fact check each other's fact checks? So, for example, say full fact checked something and it turns out it was wrong, and somebody else, which I'm not suggesting it is, but somebody else comes in and says, we don't actually agree with that assessment, and kind of have that network of interactions somehow.
I'm going to say yes, but part of the problem with this kind of data standard is it's very expressive. We've found already there's so many different ways of structuring things. You could probably already come up with a combination of the terms we've defined to express that. I think what's missing is a kind of driver in terms of tools that use that data and tools that produce that data and documentation of that pattern. And without there being a practice in the wider community to do that, sure, you could do it in schema.org, but nobody would use the data and nobody would be producing it. I think there's another question I was expecting to have heard already, which is, how do you choose which fact checks to surface in the Google platforms? I'm glad nobody's asked it, because it's a tricky question to answer. I'll echo the Facebook talk, that as a large technology company, we really like when these things can be done by wider civil society across the world. And the existence of the International Fact-Checking Network is a wonderful thing. It's still a small selection of organizations producing mostly good fact checks. And if they can peer review each other's work, as they effectively are doing, that gives us a stronger story for saying that a fact check coming from an IFCN ratified member is worth treating with some trust in the tech platforms. Being in the IFCN is not the only signal that we have. As a large search engine, we have lots of signals which we tend to be rather private about. But I think when you've got 100 fact-checking organizations coming together, talking to each other, comparing each other's work, reviewing each other's methodologies, that's a very healthy thing, because not all organizations that present as fact-checkers are pure of heart. And the more that you can review that in the wider community, the easier it is for the tech platforms to be transparent about saying, this looks like a fact checker, but it's not.
Can I add some here, just in front of you? Yes, I'm just Walid Al-Sakaf. I've just come from Tunis, where we've had a training workshop for Libyans working in a conflict zone. They're trying to create their own fact-checking organization. But one thing that emerged and made me reflect on what my colleague said earlier about the difficulty in assessing, it's not only a matter of understanding how facts are, but also the cultural aspects that can sometimes be rather different, and the idea of what is exaggeration. So one idea they came up with was fully true, fully false, or mixed, and then within the mixed, they actually pinpoint the number of sub-facts that they found, and then bring that number so that it allows the reader to decide. So that's something that you might look into.
Thanks.
Thanks. We have 2 minutes left, so maybe 1 or 2 questions.
I'm curious about the Wiki Data examples that you showed. What could Wikimedia and Wikipedians do in your eyes in terms of furthering credibility on the internet and beyond? I'm just sort of observational. I know it's kind of early.
I'm not completely sure. There's a massive community there around Wikipedia, increasingly engaging with Wiki Data. They have been creating descriptions of every news source, every newsroom, every broadcasting media company. It's still growing, but I imagine in 2 or 3 years, if a new source of information is not in Wikidata, you might want to ask why it's not there, why nobody's heard of it, what's its heritage. We did some work at the schema.org project, folding in indicators from the Trust project into our markup. So that allows the website of a newspaper, for example, to say a little bit about its processes, when it was established, and so on. And the obvious problem is you have to decide to trust the website or the source before you can trust the markup that you find there. If the same descriptive practices were happening within Wiki Data, you have a built-in peer review mechanism. It doesn't mean that Wiki Data can't be compromised, but it's naturally a multi-stakeholder environment. It's harder to lie there and have your lies survive for a long time.
All right, last question before the next speaker.
Thank you. I'm Pushkar from King's College London. So, thanks for the talk, nice analysis and tools. What do you say for different languages? Because most of the thing you present is in English, but how fact check work for different languages?
It should just work. I think there's, excuse me, there's work to do. Translations. So some of the more politically challenging environments on the world are countries where there's not just one language, where there are different communities talking to each other and past each other. And you want to be very careful when you describe a claim and when you summarize a claim to be clear who said what, whether it was translated, whether the translation was of the original or of a paraphrase. I believe we have the foundations for that in the schemas today, but as with some of the other topics, there's not really a community best practice, and it's not reflected in tooling and documentation. So there's a lot of work yet to do there.
Thanks again for the speaker. Our final speaker for the industry session is Michael